And the Australian government has recently banned the social media application TikTok on employees' work devices, begging the questions, can employers dictate your social media use? Joydeep Kaur from People and Culture Strategies joins us with some insights. Joydeep, what do you make of it?
Yeah, interesting development. It's probably the first time, surprisingly, given how long that social media has become a facet and feature of society, and indeed is being used increasingly in a workplace context, an employer, obviously a big employer being the Australian government, saying in relation to one particular app or program that's going to be banned. So a very, very significant step. Not the first time that employers are going to be seeking to regulate electronic communications usage, but it's something that very much goes against the train, and that's why it was something that sparked my curiosity, just because it is something that, in the context of how prevalent social media usage is, and it's not like TikTok has only just arrived on the scene. It is something that is very significant, and I wonder whether this is something that's going to be a bit more of a trend moving forward.
Well, right now, to what extent can an employer control or ban or influence the use of social media? I mean, I would imagine that as an employer, you can say, if you're going to be tweeting or posting anything about our workplace, within the four walls, you need to get approval. Is that sort of the extent of it right now?
Yeah, so the starting point is typically that most employees will have, pursuant to their contract of employment or their employment agreements, an obligation that they have to keep the employer's confidential information confidential. So that's the starting point. In addition to that, there are clauses that most employers have in their contracts that say that if we have policies, whether they're on an intranet or whether they're hard copy or whatever, that employees have to comply with those, that they have had policies, most employers have had policies dealing with electronic communications, dealing with social media for a number of years. So the ability and the right for an employer to control that is not problematic. And it's actually very unusual for there to be a challenge nowadays around the reasonableness of an employer introducing such a policy. What I think is very interesting about this is that an employer is probably shifting its perspective on an app that is used reasonably commonly, but perhaps not used so much in a work context. So if you take apps like LinkedIn, Twitter to a lesser extent, and Facebook, that they are actually a big part of many organisations' marketing and communication strategies. So employees in many instances are encouraged to use social media when it comes to those particular things. But when it comes to something like TikTok, which is not going to be in the general course of things seen as a business social media tool, and now has had these security concerns identified with it, it's interesting that an employer is saying, well, no, when it comes to that, we're separating what's okay social media versus what's not okay social media. And where I think this will play out even more interestingly is, what if employees say, well, I can understand that if there's that work social media, that is okay, that you can regulate what I do in that space, but what if I'm going to be doing something purely on my personal time, and an employer doesn't have a right to control that? But this is where it starts to get very murky. What happens when an employee comes to work, it's not connected to their work account, it might be their lunch break, they've stepped outside for their lunch or a coffee or whatever it might be, and they're accessing TikTok on a personal phone. That would be okay, one presumes, but if they're doing so on a work phone, that's a problem.
Okay, so what can you do if compliance is not forthcoming?
So ultimately, the lesson with all of this for employers, it's first and foremost, it helps if you have a rationale as to why your policies are your policies. And if there are security concerns and you've got evidence for that, you build credibility with your workforce, so long as you are open and transparent about what those concerns are that you have. What employees, as a general rule, don't like is an employer that is encroaching into what they see as their private, personal time and space. And so what I think the challenge is for employers here is, if they're going to say that certain social media apps or any kind of, let's call it IT usage, is problematic, you've got to be very clear that It's about the particular times or the particular devices through which it's used that's a problem, and that you're not overstepping the mark. What an employee does in their private time, generally speaking, should not be the concern of an employer. However, we know that in social media context, there have been some very high-profile cases where an employee has tweeted something, albeit on a personal account, not ostensibly connected to their work, but because they are so interconnected and often the face of their employer, that the employer's taken action. So this just continues, Nadine, to be a really problematic space, and I think this latest development's just confirmation of that.